think about those examples. Think about all the different ways that you could say that exact same rule, and then return to that so that you can teach yourself if you ever encounter it in the abstract. So I see that Bertina and Sonia and other people are complaining about, like, hey, what happens when I encounter this on a game? Because the games, the rules tend to be really abstract. But the sufficient condition is always going to be the trigger on the rule. The necessary condition is always going to be the thing that must be true whenever the sufficient condition is true. It's important to note that when the sufficient condition is false, then I don't know shit, right? So return to your basic example. If you're in Boston, you have to be in Massachusetts. John's not in Boston, therefore, I don't give a shit about John, okay? The rule is, if you're in Boston, you have to be in Massachusetts. The second someone isn't in Boston, I don't care anymore. The rule does not apply to them. So who cares? I don't need the contrapositive in that case because they're just not in Boston. So I can't prove whether they are or are not in Massachusetts. They could be in Massachusetts. They could be in Springfield. If you're in Boston, you have to be in Massachusetts. So contrapositive, common sense. If you're not in Massachusetts, you can't be in Boston. You can return to that example, and you might need to, because the LSAT might say something like, you can't have psychology unless you have sociology. And now we have entered the realm of the abstract, at least insofar as, wait, what? Why do you have to have sociology every time you have psychology? Why is that a rule? That was not the rule when I registered for classes. What? But if they present you in a logic game with the rule, you can't have psychology without sociology, or another way of saying that, if you have psychology, you have to have sociology, or another way of saying that, one can have psychology only if one has sociology, or another way of saying that, the only people who take psychology must take sociology. I could go on all day, literally, with different ways of any person who takes psychology has to take sociology, okay? It's an abstract rule, but the trigger on the rule there is if you take psychology, you have to take sociology. And then from there, we can arrive at the contrapositive. Even if we don't understand why this rule is true, we don't have to. We have to accept it as a fact. If you take psychology, you must take sociology, or you can't take psychology unless you take sociology. It's just another way of saying the same thing. We can then arrive at the contrapositive of this rule. 2 steps. We're going to switch the order and we're going to switch the signs. So sociology moves over here to the left, psychology goes over there to the right, and then we have to switch the signs. So the positives become negative and the negatives become positives. If you don't have sociology, you can't have psychology, is the contrapositive of the rule. If you take psychology, you have to take sociology. And that's just 2 different ways of looking at the exact same rule. But it's abstract. And you've got to be able to deal with even weirder abstractions than that. Most of you probably took psychology and or sociology at some point in your academic careers. And so you can at least latch on to, okay, for whatever reason, if you have psych, you have to have soc. Okay, fine. How about a rule like, if X, then no Y? Now we're purely abstract because we don't even know what X and Y possibly represent. But if indicates a sufficient condition. Another way of saying that would be, only if you don't take Y can you take X, because only if introduces the necessary condition, which means the rest of the statement has to be the sufficient condition. You could also have said, you can't take X unless you don't take Y. That's another way of saying this exact same statement, which is if you have X, you can't have Y. Purely in the realm of the abstract now. But again, we can do the contrapositive of this statement. It's 2 steps. We have to switch the order and we have to switch the signs. So the Y was negative. It comes over here and turns positive. The X was positive. It goes over here and it turns negative. And now we have the contrapositive of this original statement, which is the exact same statement, just looked at in another way. If you have Y, you can't have X. We also should be able to recognize whenever they fuck it up. Even if they fuck it up in the abstract, we should be able to notice that they have fucked it up. So if the rule was, if we have X, we must not have Y, if that was the rule, and then they go, therefore, since we didn't have Y, we can't have X, and you have to bust them on it. You have to step up and go, no, the rule was if you have X, you can't have Y. But if you don't have Y, I don't care whether you have X. The trigger on the rule was if you have X. If you have X, you can't have Y. You don't get to just say, oh, therefore, if you don't have Y, you have to have X. That's not how this works. And you might be able to like reverse unabstract it, right? You might be able to like, well, wait a second, this rule, if you have X, you can't have Y. I can come up with an example that might follow that same form, which would be something like, if you smoke, you are not healthy. I know that that's a relative term. Don't fucking at me about that. It's like, whatever. You're not as healthy as you could be, okay? So if you smoke, you are not healthy. That follows the same form as this, right? But it would be pretty ridiculous to say, if you're not healthy, therefore you have to smoke. There's plenty of other ways. You could just catch COVID. There's plenty of other ways to not be healthy that have nothing to do with smoking. Yeah, I get it. If you do smoke, you're not healthy. But the fact that somebody's not healthy doesn't mean they have to smoke. That's not how this works. Well, if this is stupid, then this is stupid too. Because algebra. We have lots of lessons in the daemon. I think if you've understood what I've said so far, then I think you're primed now to go through all of those lessons that already exist in the daemon. And there are like quizzes and there's drills and there's specific questions, like specific logical reasoning questions that have to do with conditional reasoning, or there are specific logic games that have to do with conditional reasoning. And we will continue to flesh out those lessons and make them better and better over time. But I hope that what I've given you so far, at least maybe for some of you, makes it click like on the just the foundation of it.